welcome to this webinar entitled COVID-19 Vaccine Legal and HR Challenges for Employers. Now, COVID-19, I think is undoubtedly, one of those life-changing experiences. It's disrupted our lives in a way that we never imagined. In fact, we never even did webinars before COVID-19 came about. Now it's happening on a regular basis. Prior to COVID-19 coming in, I remember there were all these Hollywood movies like Contagion and Outbreak. And I have to say, I thought this is really unrealistic. This won't happen. So boring. I'm not going to watch it. But what I thought was unrealistic has become quite real. And I suppose this experience, if I survive long enough, I guess it will be a story I'll tell grandkids, if I have any, about how we lived through this situation. I suppose just like my parents and grandparents used to tell me stories about World War II. After COVID-19 emerged in 2020, it has significantly become a threat to public health. In fact, it is a serious threat to our survival, really, as a species on this planet. On March 11, 2020, the WHO declared it a pandemic. Pandemic as opposed to an epidemic. A pandemic is an epidemic which has spread over several countries, continents, and affects a large group of people. As at yesterday, based on a tracking website I was looking at, 143 million people have contracted COVID-19 around the world, and more than 3 million have died. And even with those who have recovered, there are some who have suffered physical permanent damage, and yet there are many others who do not even show symptoms. This virus, in terms of how it spreads, doesn't seem to discriminate whether you are a clerk in SKRINE's office or whether you are the president of the United States. Everybody can get it. In Malaysia, I had a look, and we are now have more than 355,000 cases, with almost 1,400 deaths. And again, with the numbers now rising again to more than 2,000 cases a day, we now need to relook at the measures to contain it while balancing our economic needs, because there always needs to be a balance. Otherwise, we may survive the pandemic, but we may die of starvation or something, right? That's all the reality. With the growing numbers in Malaysia, I was just reading an article yesterday morning, although I think things have changed. The stock market in Malaysia has also started to drop, as there are serious concerns as to whether there'll be more restrictions on business operations which could affect their performance. But there seems to be light at the end of the tunnel. Vaccines have emerged. It's just amazing. We're waiting like 1 year, 9 months, 10 months for a vaccine to emerge. Suddenly, one company announces a vaccine. Next day, somebody else announces a vaccine, and then later on, other companies announce vaccines. So vaccines seems to have emerged. Vaccines are the most effective medication in public health, as they control and prevent the spread of infectious disease and deaths. If we look through history, from the mid-20th century, humans have managed to eliminate diseases like smallpox and polio. However, like any other medication, the allergic reactions can also happen. And while the literature I've read says that reactions are not serious in most cases, in some cases, it can be life-threatening, and it can cause serious complications. Also, we have to understand that these vaccines are at an early stage. Data is limited, data is limited, and I think over time we will learn about how effective these vaccines are. Malaysians, as well as foreigners residing here, are due to be vaccinated in stages, or at least they are allowed to register to be vaccinated in stages. But parliaments around the world, they have not legislated to make it mandatory. Apart from the fact that, of course, in Malaysia, our parliament cannot even meet now, right, with the emergency proclamation. I would suggest that why it is also not being made mandatory is because at the moment, supply is limited. We have 7 billion people on this planet, and it's not going to happen overnight that everybody is going to get vaccinated straight away. In fact, there's this tension going on in Europe about supply because some people are getting it, some countries are getting more, and all this is because everybody or most countries want their population to be vaccinated as quickly as possible. My understanding is phase 2 has only just started in Malaysia, and we still have a long way to go. The second reason why I think is right now, it has also not come to a stage where it is necessary to achieve public health objectives that everybody be vaccinated, right? It's not even on the table. And the government, I notice what it's doing is it's employing persuasion, right? The Prime Minister, for example, he has led by example. He has taken the first vaccine, and by that, he's hoping the population will follow. But for employers in the meanwhile, as long as the law does not make it mandatory, they're left in a bit of a conundrum. They have various duties when operating a business, which can run counter to not having employees vaccinated. Employers owe legal duties, contractual duties to employees to provide a safe and healthy workplace. They also they have a legal duty to third parties who deal with them. And also, whenever there's a positive case in a workplace, there will be disruption to productivity. You might need to shut down operations, you need to sanitize, there'll be cost involved, and potentially there's also reputational damage facing an organization. Although with the number of cases going on right now, I think the reputational damage is not as I would say not as great as before at the earlier stages. Nevertheless, the issues facing the employer is not so straightforward. Can we just go to the next slide, Umi? So today, what we will deal with is these set of questions, which many employers need to consider in dealing with this issue of vaccinating its workforce. The first question, if I can just go to the next slide, is can an employer make vaccine mandatory? Very basic question. Well, the answer is generally no, right? And can we just go to the next slide? The law has not made it mandatory. And the answer is no, unless the employee has consented to it, or the law is amended, or we have some kind of government directive stating that you require to have your employees vaccinated. And in a third situation, which I'll discuss later, which is more of an extreme situation where the employer has no real choice but to impose vaccination. And the issue will become whether this requirement to vaccinate is a reasonable and lawful instruction given by the employer. At the moment, I'd be shocked if there are employment contracts which state employer can require employee to vaccinate. This was never in the contemplation prior to COVID-19. But this will be a term which you should consider moving forward, putting into your contract. Employers, rather than imposing, will need to look at how to encourage its employees, incentivize its employees in other ways to make your people understand and appreciate the benefits of vaccination. And this is something which Siew will deal with later on. Making it compulsory as well is very risky. And I would say, as I'll discuss later, it should only be considered as a last resort. Maybe we go on to the next slide, and Siew, you can deal with the next issues.
All right, thank you. Now moving on to this, the next slide. What are the duties under OSHA? OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Act 1994 in Malaysia. One of the main objects of this act is to secure the safety, health, and welfare of persons at work. The OSHA imposes a duty on employers towards their employees, a duty on employers towards third parties, persons other than the employees, and a duty on employees themselves. In respect of the duty on employers, Section 15 is the relevant section. Section 15 of OSHA imposes a duty on the employer to ensure, so far as is practicable, the safety, health, and welfare at work of all its employees. Section 16 of OSHA, this is the duty on the employer to formulate a safety and health policy and to revise or update the same as often as may be appropriate. Next slide. Moving on to the duty towards third parties, Section 17 of OSHA provides the general duties of employers to persons other than his employees to ensure, so far as is practicable, that the third parties are not exposed to risk to their safety or health. Then you have Section 18 of OSHA. Section 18 provides the duties of an occupier of a place of work to persons, again, other than his employees, to third parties, to take such measures, again, measures as are practicable to ensure that their premises, all means of access thereto, any plant substance in the premises are safe and without risk to health. Next slide. Then, on to the duty of employees themselves, you have Section 24 of OSHA, which provides the general duties on employees while at work. So, under Section 24, the employee has a duty while at work to do all these things, to take reasonable care for the safety and health of himself and of other persons who may be affected. B, cooperate with his employer on any requirement imposed. C, wear or use at all times any protective equipment or clothing provided by the employer. This will be the PPE, mask, etc. D, to comply with any instruction or measure on occupational safety and health instituted by his employer. It is also important to point out that in any case, all employers also have a common law implied duty to provide a safe working environment for all the employees. Next slide. So, what then can employers do? So, generally, you cannot compel employees to vaccinate. What then can you do? The first question is, can you make vaccination a term of employment? For new employees, this is quite straightforward. You can require vaccination as a precondition for employment. It is similar to asking employment candidates to undergo a medical examination, doing background checks or reference checks, etc. We have no laws prohibiting such requirements. It really is just a case of whether a candidate is suitable for employment. And part of the criteria of suitability for the role may include the employee having been vaccinated. However, it is not as easy with existing employees. As a general rule, if an employer seeks to impose a new term and condition of employment, which would put the employee in a less favorable position, as is arguably the case here, because the employee must now fulfill this additional condition of employment of being vaccinated, you will need the employee's consent. In other words, seeing that employers lack the authority in law to make vaccinations mandatory to begin with, it follows that you similarly cannot change the term of employment or revise the employment contract to require existing employees to get themselves vaccinated. You need their consent. Next slide. Next question would then be, have you assessed the risk in your business to determine how important vaccination is to your industry? Is your industry a high risk industry? Next slide. So, does the nature of work require physical interaction with individuals, particularly particularly the high risk group? Does the job require travel, whether overseas or interstate? Is it a legal requirement, whether under OSHA or pursuant to the Employees Minimum Standards of Housing Accommodations and Amenities Act 1990, for example? Because under that particular act, the Employees Minimum Standards Act, a medical officer of health can actually direct that an employer arrange for immunization of its employees on the estate. Or maybe it's a legal requirement because there's some other directive from the authorities for you to vaccinate your employees. So is it a legal requirement? So these considerations you have to balance against perhaps reasonable reasons that may be given by your employees for not wanting to be vaccinated. For example, maybe they are pregnant or they have suffered allergic reaction to vaccinations in the past, or perhaps they have some other medical reason. Next slide. Now, let us have a quick look at perhaps some examples of the high risk industries. Childcare services where perhaps children are too young to be vaccinated, old folks home, F&B, tourism, recreation industry, barber, hair or beauty salon. Next slide. Construction, agriculture, manufacturing, education, gym, sports, or even maybe industries where the employees need to fly frequently for work. Next slide. So once you have made your assessment of your risk, you should then craft a vaccination policy for your organization. As we discussed earlier under section 16 of the OSHA, there is a duty to formulate a safety and health policy. So could it be part of the employer's duty here to prepare a vaccination policy? Arguably, the answer is yes. Now, essentially, your policy should be tailored to take into consideration the risk, to explain to your employees the importance of the vaccination to your business, to state if the company is providing incentives to the employees to be vaccinated, as well as the process of getting and notifying of the vaccination and the process for applying for exceptions from vaccination. For example, medical or religious reasons. Then once your policy is ready, you will then need to communicate the policy to the employees. If after all this is done and an employee still refuses to be vaccinated, the employer should then determine its next course of action depending on how critical it is for its business for the relevant employee to be vaccinated. This will be covered later in the session. Next slide. So now let us look at how to encourage employee buy-in, seeing that employee buy-in is key. To do this, employers need to strategize how to create awareness around the vaccination program and to make credible information regarding the COVID-19 vaccine provided by the government available to their employees, alongside information on the importance and relevance of vaccination given the nature of your business. So one way of encouraging employees to be vaccinated, which has gained traction in the US, is to give employees what is called vaccine leave or paid time off. Sorry, next slide. Sorry, the one before. Yes. So one way of encouraging employees to be vaccinated, which has gained traction, is to give employees vaccine leave or paid time off to take the jabs. Other than that, some employers are also offering to cover the costs of the employee taking the vaccine. Currently, vaccinations are free in Malaysia, but perhaps covering the cost of the vaccine may make sense if eventually private hospitals are allowed to procure the COVID-19 vaccine. Can companies take things one step further and financially incentivize the vaccination of employees? For example, by paying to the employee a vaccine bonus for being vaccinated. Or perhaps on the flip side, punish an employee who refuses to be vaccinated indirectly by informing them that there may be repercussions if they refuse to be vaccinated, including the fact that they must be ready to accept that their job scope may change to manage the risk of their being unvaccinated. Or perhaps that their being unvaccinated may affect their job progression, seeing that senior management in the company have to travel for work. So essentially, to tell the employee no jab, no job progression. So I think at the end of the day, the choice depends on the employer's risk appetite. In my personal view, I would not recommend financially incentivizing the vaccination. This is keeping in mind that vaccinations are not with zero risk, and that there could be a remote race case where an employee develops serious adverse side effects, and the company may not wish to be seen to unreasonably push the employees towards getting the vaccination. Conservatively, and of course, the most prudent approach to me would be to run campaigns within your company to create awareness and to make information on the vaccination available to your employees. Insofar as incentivizing goes, I would say perhaps go as far as throwing in the vaccine leave and vaccine allowance to defray any expenses by the employee, perhaps on the way to the clinic to get the vaccinations and so on. Next slide. So recently, I saw this media release by OCBC Bank on the rollout of what they call their COVID-19 vaccination support program. Based on the media release, the bank, which is the first in the company to publicly announce such support measures for their employees, have started to incentivize more than 5,000 of their staff to sign up. The OCBC Bank COVID-19 vaccination program consists of a day off for their staff to go for vaccination, medical leave without the need for any medical certificate, so without the need for MC for up to 2 days if the staff experiences side effects, option to work from home for 1 week after vaccination, transport reimbursement for fares to and from vaccination clinics or centers, medical consultation reimbursement if the employees need to consult a doctor for side effects arising from the vaccination. Also, it was mentioned in this media release, Dato Ong, the CEO of OCBC Bank, made this statement. While the decision to take up the vaccination lies entirely with the staff, we would like them to know that we will be behind them all the way should they decide to sign up for the program. Now, just based on this media release, I would say that this is an example of a well thought out and well communicated policy rollout. If you can see from even the statement by the CEO, he basically puts the decision ultimately in the hands of the employees, although he makes it very clear that OCBC is fully supporting their decision to be vaccinated should they decide to do so. So, as discussed earlier, the manner of communication to the employees is key. Next slide. So, what happens if you have a partially vaccinated workforce? So having a partially vaccinated workforce will certainly come with, its own set of challenges. Perhaps you could get complaints by certain employees that an employee is endangering the safety of others at the workplace due to not being vaccinated. So, needless to say, this is a tricky issue, but I think we must approach it logically and reasonably. Logically, an employee who is already vaccinated cannot validly raise this complaint as a complaint because the employee would already be protected and will have a low risk of being infected or having the infection result in a serious adverse consequence. So the first thing to do for the employers would be to filter out which employees are raising this as a complaint and consider whether the complaint is reasonable based on the circumstances. If you think the complaint is reasonable, for example, if it's been raised perhaps by a pregnant breastfeeding employee or someone who has been medically advised not to be vaccinated, I think the employers should then take the next step of considering its options on how it may make the workplace safe for the employee depending on the situation. Perhaps the complainant may be allowed to work from home or from a different premise where the employee is less likely to be endangered. Or perhaps it could be the unvaccinated employee who is required to work from home. So there is no one size fits all solution to this. It all depends on the situation at hand. In these circumstances, I think the employer will be found to have acted reasonably if it has taken the steps to try to reach this fair and reasonable balance between the complainant and also the unvaccinated employee. So what this really means is that the vaccine rollout currently is not a quick fix. I think employers will still need to exercise a lot of discretion moving forward in deciding who may or may not come back to work, how to continue to enforce your work from home policies, and how you're going to encourage safe practices at work. These are all, I think, practical ways in balancing the different needs of your employees at the workplace and maintaining the safety of everyone. Next slide. Kumar will now take the next part on what if, after all these, employees refuse to be vaccinated.
Yes. Now, ideally, everyone will do what is right and get vaccinated unless they have some good medical reasons for not doing so. The suggestions which Suli addressed, I think, especially in terms of the incentives, these can work. Okay, I mean, just from personal experience, I can tell you that my father-in-law, initially, when we told him about the vaccination, he said, "No, I'm not going to do it." I asked him why. He said, "I don't like needles. It's painful." But then we told him, if you don't vaccinate, most countries won't let you travel and you won't be able to travel again. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, I can't travel. If that's the case, then maybe I'll just put up with the pain and have the vaccine. So different people have different points or different things that encourage them to get this done. There's all sorts of material going around, whether it's fake news or not, but some people seem to be working themselves up in a frenzy and getting very, very concerned about the vaccine. And some are just completely relaxed and hardly do any reading about vaccine. And if it happens, it happens. It doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. So ultimately, though, based on at least the WHO advisory and also what the government is doing, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, vaccines have proved effective in controlling public health. But after all this persuasion, incentives, somebody says, I'm not going to do it. Now, in that situation, I think it's ultimately going to come down to whether the employer is in a position to give an instruction to vaccinate that is both reasonable and lawful. Now, the rule is all reasonable and lawful instructions given by the employer, they must be obeyed. Otherwise, the employee is committing a misconduct. At the moment, there is no case law in Malaysia. This is a very new area of law in Malaysia. But this would be what I would think the court would do. In deciding whether the instruction to vaccinate is lawful and reasonable, the court is likely to look at it on a case-to-case basis, right? And when I say on a case-to-case basis, it will involve, I think like earlier, one of the slides on the balancing act mentioned by Suli, looking at the nature of work and industry, whether it's a high-risk industry, does it involve physical interaction with individuals, especially those in high-risk groups? Say if you are the customer service person and you have to interact with, say, policy holders or banking customers, or if you're in healthcare, this would be high risk, right? Second, I would say they will consider things like, would you be able to do your job if you're not vaccinated? If governments overseas say, look, only those who are vaccinated are allowed to travel, or even let's say our own Malaysian government says, you can only do interstate travel if you are vaccinated, and you have a job which requires you to travel from one state to another or from one country to another, and then you say, I don't want to be vaccinated, essentially you'll end up being homebound and you will not be able to perform your job. The other thing I would say the court will probably consider is also the employer's duties, right? Bearing in mind, like as Yuli mentioned, the risk that your industry faces or this particular role faces, the duty of the employer to employees as well as to third parties. The next point is, I think the court will also be influenced by any instructions or any directives or SOPs by health officials regarding the need to vaccinate. Another point I would say the court would consider is, can the person still carry out the function of their job effectively and not pose a significant risk to others without vaccinating, right? So in a situation where, for example, we are dealing with somebody or function which can be performed from home, and we've all learned how to perform from home in one way or other. And if the job can be performed from home, is this something that can be done, right? Basically, we are looking at alternatives. Now, all these things, your nature of industry, job nature, your duties to other employees, third parties, instructions, all these would then need to be balanced with the employee side as well, which is maybe the employee has a good medical reason for not vaccinating. There is health risk involved. Maybe there could be religious reasons. Or is it a case of the employee just stubbornly refusing? So I would say this would need to be balanced with the employee's reason for not vaccinating. And even if the employee gives the reasons, are those reasons proven? Do they have a medical certificate or medical report, for example, saying that either pregnancy or due to certain pre-existing health conditions, being vaccinated is unsafe for this person? I would also say that the court would consider whether the employer can put in place other measures where the employee can still perform without vaccinating. For example, as Siew mentioned, under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the employees can be required to cooperate and to wear all protective equipment. So can you get this person to perform by making this person wear their PPE while working? Could you designate a particular part of the office where all the unvaccinated people, for example, could sit together, right? Could it be possible for them to work from home, right? I think these are factors that the court will look to balance with. And also, I would say another important factor would be whether the employer has given the employee reasonable opportunity and warning to comply. The employee may face certain anxiety, concerns about being vaccinated. And because the employee is facing these concerns, maybe the employer needs to spend some time to provide the relevant literature, or maybe to speak to a doctor, an opportunity to get a proper consultation in order to make their decision. So the employee's actions will also be relevant. So these would be all relevant factors, I would say, that would be taken into account in ultimately deciding whether or not an extreme situation exists that the employer has really no choice but to make this instruction or make it mandatory for this particular employee to be vaccinated. Now, because vaccines are new, this area of law is very new in Malaysia. Actually, around the world, it's probably very new. But recently, we came across two cases in Australia, which can provide some guidance. Can we just look at the next slide, please? And the first case involves this Nicole Marie. Now, both these cases, unfortunately, don't specifically decide the issue, but they give some guidance on how in Australia this issue would probably be dealt with. And Malaysia also being a common law country, and especially when we are dealing with a new area of law, we sometimes look at what other jurisdictions, how other jurisdictions are approaching the issue. Now, in the first case involving this Nicole Marie, what had happened was this was an issue about whether she could file her claim out of time. So essentially, she was seeking extension of time. Now, whenever you seek extension of time, one of the considerations is the merits of the case. So there was a discussion on the merits of the case. Now, in this particular case, Nicole Marie was working in childcare. The employee, so she dealt with many young children who are not being vaccinated. The employer had a vaccination policy. They said, look, it's mandatory. By this particular date, you need to be vaccinated. The employee said, no, I'm not going to do it. The reason why she didn't want to do it was not for some medical grounds. Instead, I think I noticed that she was referring to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and some other forced labor conventions and saying that, look, on that basis, I am not going to do it because I have the human right to say no. She was dismissed. And she brought a claim in her, as I mentioned, it was out of time. On the issue of the merits, they didn't say that she had a conclusive claim on the merits or a good claim on the merits. They just said neutral. But in examining whether or not it was it had any basis this Fair Works Commission stated that, look, in this particular instance, the mandatory vaccination is prima facie lawful and reasonable in the context of childcare, because in this case, the industry was childcare. The children are too young to be vaccinated, and you're exposing them to all sorts of health risk. They also said prima facie the policy was necessary to meet the duty of care owed by the childcare facility, the employer in that particular case, to the children. While of course we need to balance against the needs of an employee who may have reasonable grounds to reject. And in this particular case, they said it is arguable she was unreasonable in refusing this after performing this balancing act. Okay. The next case, so as you can see from this case, this was a balancing act that was performed in deciding it. The difficulty with balancing act is it means that there's no one answer. We have to look at the facts and circumstance of each situation. The next case was that involving Maria Corazon. The issue again in that case was whether she was dismissed. And so they didn't go into dealing with the merits in detail. Maria Corazon was a long-time employee and working in a elderly care facility. She refused to be vaccinated. Why? Because she said, look, when I was 7 years old and I was working, when I was living in the Philippines, I had a vaccine and I had an allergic reaction. So I'm afraid of vaccines. I'm not going to do it. Now, there was no doctor who was able to verify it. In fact, when you look at it, the doctor just said, she says when she was 7 years old, she had this thing and that's it. But there's no medical evidence to support her contention. As a result, what the employer did was they said, okay, and since you are not vaccinated, we are not going to roster you. Basically, she had no work and they placed her on unpaid leave and they said, you'll be placed on unpaid leave until she was vaccinated. So she said, look, in effect, you're dismissing me because I'm not going to get vaccinated. And her claim was, I was unfairly dismissed. So the preliminary issue, the first issue was she dismissed by placing her on unpaid leave? That one, the court said, yes, she was dismissed. But while they said she was dismissed, they said, look, we will decide the fairness of her dismissal. And in Australia, the issue is the dismissal fair? This Works Commission stated its view, saying that we need to look at the circumstances of the role, the workplace, and see whether it was the relevant instruction to get vaccinated was lawful and reasonable. They suggested that the refusal in this particular case, where the employer is able to show that it is necessary, they suggested without deciding it finally, they says, look, if it's a lawful and reasonable instruction, then regardless of your reason, it doesn't matter whether it's medical or religious or whatever the case may be, your dismissal is justified if it's in a setting or in a place where it's high risk and social distancing is not possible. So again, unfortunately, they don't decide the issue then and there, but they are giving some guidance on how they will consider this issue. If you ask me, this balancing act is something that makes sense in order to find where the justice of the case lies. But at the same time, it makes employers' lives more difficult because it's risky. And when we are talking about fact-sensitive issues, one person may say this one is fair. Another person may say, oh, I don't think this is fair. It can go either way, and you do face these risks. So, can I go to the next slide? In relation to this, the balancing of these considerations, I think one of the issues, first thing, as Siew mentioned, you should have a policy, a vaccination policy, stating what incentives that you have and consistently applying it, right? And this would be a good defense. Say, for example, you treated a person who's vaccinated different from the way from somebody who's not vaccinated. This would be a good defense because you have a policy in place and you can say there's no discrimination. This is something I'm doing for my workplace and I'm just merely applying this policy across the board. I don't care about your race, your religion, or anything like that. It is all about whether you're vaccinated or not. And why this issue is important is because it affects the health and safety of our employees as well as others in the workplace. Apart from the policy, the next thing is look at those alternative arrangements in dealing with a particular person's job, whether or not maybe this person could work as much from home as much as possible, come to work 1 day a week maybe, but when they come in, wear the PPE, wear the mask, wear the shield, and these are things which could be considered. I am not in favor of, say, reducing job scope or changing somebody from full-time to part-time, because when you do something like that, you need to be able to justify it. Also, there's a big risk that if you dismiss an employee pursuant to disciplinary action because they didn't comply, the employee is going to bring an unjust dismissal claim. In those proceedings, the employer's main defense is going to be, look, I did dismiss this person, but it is with just cause or excuse. And as I mentioned, this thing about just cause or excuse, which are really talking about what is fair or what is just, is very fact sensitive, right? The court will need to carefully analyze the factual situation. And one person will say, oh, this is just cause or excuse. Another person will say, may come to a different conclusion. So I would say, if you're going to like reduce job scope or eventually say take disciplinary action or take disciplinary action or terminate somebody, these are really last resort actions for employers. You should try as much as possible to exhaust other remedies before you consider this. Okay, can we just go to the next slide? Now, this question here about deals with the risk if the employee suffers an adverse reaction. This is something to seriously consider for employers if it is made mandatory. The reality is every drug, right? Every drug you buy has in its fine print, normally you'll get in the box there and then it's all in very small letters there. They'll say some adverse effects. Most of us never read it. Nothing is ever 100%. No drug ever works 100% to everybody across the board. So there is some risk, but in reality, in life, right, everything got risk, right? You cross the road, also got some risk, isn't it? So the question is this some reasonable risk? Now, say you have a situation where, unfortunately, this particular employee, pursuant to your policy, goes out there and makes what do you call it? Goes and gets vaccinated, and has a very serious health consequence as a result of taking the vaccination. Can that employee come back and say, hey, I have now suffered loss or this damage because of the employer's instructions? I am therefore holding the employer liable to compensate me for my loss. And you know, who knows that? Like I said, the vaccine is new. People can get, I don't know, maybe in a mild case, it might be some rashes or something. But what if it gets into something serious, like you go into some nervous shock, or, you know, if something really bad happens and the employee passes away due to some reaction, can the employee come back, or even the employee's estate, for example, come back and sue an employer? Now, this is a real risk which needs to be considered, especially if you make the policy or you make it mandatory for the employee to get vaccinated. So it is important that, you know, in the policy which Siew mentioned, that you look into the similar type of wording which OCBC, the similar kind of message that OCBC has put forward, for example. And I would add that which is basically saying that each employee needs to make their own independent decision. We will support you, but you need to make your own independent decision. But I would go forward and say, I would encourage the employees to assess their own health and health condition with a medical practitioner before they make their independent decision. Also, you may want to look there and say that, look, ultimately the employee has to be responsible for any adverse consequences for the vaccination. This is something like a disclaimer you want to put in place when giving out any incentives or person to any policy that you may want to implement, because as I mentioned, the vaccines are new, and we don't know whether in a few years down the track some new adverse consequences are suddenly discovered, and then they turn around and say, oh, the employer is the one who made me do it, therefore the employer should be held liable. Okay, next slide, Suli. You want to deal with the data privacy?
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so on to the final issue on whether there are any data privacy issues arising from this vaccination of employees. I guess the main question here would be, can you compel your employee to tell you the status of their vaccination? Yes, I'm vaccinated, or no, I've not been vaccinated. The short answer here is no. Unless you have the employee's consent for you to process the information on their health in your existing PDPA notice and consent form. This is because under the Personal Data and Protection Act 2010, sensitive personal data is defined to include any personal data consisting of information as to the physical health or condition of the employee or the data subject. An employee's COVID-19 vaccination status would therefore fall within this definition of sensitive personal data under the PDPA. Accordingly, under Section 40 of the PDPA, employers, being the data user, right, under the Act, should obtain explicit consent of its employees, being the data subject, before they process the COVID-19 vaccination status information of their employees, which is sensitive personal data. While there are Section 40 exemptions under the Act, which allow the processing of the sensitive personal data where it is necessary in order to exercise or perform an obligation conferred or imposed by law in connection with employment. This arguably could be an employer's obligations under OSHA, or the other exemption is where the processing of this information is necessary to protect the vital interests of another person, and the consent by or on behalf of the employee has been unreasonably withheld by the employee. So although there are these two exemptions, it is still uncertain as to whether the employer will be able to rely on these exemptions or not. Just to note that a person who contravenes the PDPA, this particular provision, commits an offence and shall, on conviction, be liable to a fine not exceeding 200,000 ringgit or to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years, or to both. So in short, the prudent approach is to obtain the explicit consent from your employees to process their sensitive personal data, including information on their health, if you haven't already done so. While there is no specific form of the consent prescribed under the PDPA, the consent should be in a form that can be recorded and maintained properly by the data user. The consent should also, as far as possible, be clear and unambiguous. I think we received one question earlier in the chat on how long these data can be retained as well. And based on the PDPA 2010 states that you cannot retain personal data longer than necessary to fulfill the function in which it was collected. So it is as long as the data is necessary. Once that purpose has been fulfilled, you must then take all reasonable precautions to destroy or delete the data that you have collected.
Yeah, I think just to add, because there was a question on this issue. First of all, sorry, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, when Julie was talking, these were the two exemptions she was talking about. She was mentioning to Section 40 of the PDPA, which could potentially apply. But in reality, I think most of you, especially when the PDPA came into force, most employers would have already got their employees to sign off on a notice, right, as part of their terms and conditions of employment. Because you will be allowed to process their personal data, including their sensitive personal data. And sensitive personal data includes health information. And this is something which, under the Act, it requires explicit consent, right? It means like express something in writing, or an email or something like that, to consent to it. So there was a question here: can employer request for employees to update their vaccination status, i.e., have they been vaccinated or not, and to keep the record? So the first thing is, how are you going to get this information? So this is just my thoughts. First of all, if you're going to get this information, the incentives which Shuli mentioned earlier would come in relevant. For example, if you're going to say, look, you're going to get a day off on the day you're going to get vaccinated, if you go and get vaccinated, or we will pay for your reimbursement, you will ask them for proof of vaccination in order to pay this, provide this incentive. So in the process of them coming to claim their leave, or to come there and claim their incentive payment, or I think Suli was mentioning some vaccine bonus and so on, you will be able to gather this information. The second part of this question is, can I retain it? Can I keep this information in the company? So answer is, first of all, do you have already or express consent from the employee to have it, right, and to keep it and process it? But if you don't, maybe you should do it now, or as quickly as possible. Of course, I would say that if you're doing something now, don't just say vaccine information, cover something broader. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? Have a broad PDPA notice which you get everybody to agree to, everybody in the organization to agree to, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, and you don't want to go back there again and say, 2 years now we got a new issue now, can you please sign this one? Now it covers some other information. So it should be something broad. On a worst case scenario, if the employee does not agree to it, then you may want to think whether in your situation you can keep that data pursuant to the exemptions Shuli has mentioned, especially the second one here in this slide, which is to protect the vital interests of another person, right? And the employee has unreasonably withheld the consent. So if you have tried over and over again, and this is necessary so that, say now you're going to put this employee to be seated next to some 70-year-old employee in the company, and this employee is not vaccinated, this is something which could affect that 70-year-old's health, right? But having said that, look, it may not be just the 70-year-old, they may be in higher risk. Other groups also face risk as well in terms of their health and well-being. So that was the first question I noticed that was asked. The second question which was asked is for employees who do not opt for vaccination, can they be stopped from working from office? So this one, to deal with this question, we come back to that, your policy, your situation, as I've mentioned before, this is a sensitive issue. If the situation in your company, say now, okay, the easy example, elderly care. You are involved in elderly care, or for that matter, maybe you are in the healthcare services, and you're dealing with people who are coming in. Normally, you come to hospital, you already got some underlying problem. The last thing you want is for your nurse or your doctor or somebody in your reception to pass on some extra, COVID-19 to this particular patient, for example, right? And in those situations, I would think that, just like that Australian case I referred to, there would be at least some basis for you to do so, right? To ask them to not come to the office. But if there are other measures that can be put in place, for example, if they can wear a shield, wear their gloves, wear a mask, and they can continue to operate and work in this environment safely without endangering anybody else, then I would say this is not something reasonable to do by saying, okay, you just stay at home, especially if the nature of their work requires them to be physically present, right? Okay, are there any other questions? Can we go to the next slide? Is there a next slide? Yeah, okay. Oh, any questions? All right. Oh, only question is, may I know whether the slides will be sent to participants? Umi, well, what is the answer?
Yes, we'll share to everyone.
Okay.
Hello. Hello.
Yes. Somebody is saying something.
Okay, I've got a question. Yep. My name is Wan. My concern is that, let's say, Suli and you have already explained very well in detail, just that, let's say if the company were to put this vaccination as mandatory in the context of safety and also to protect the well-being of our employees, and so happen is that one of the employee who got himself vaccinated suddenly, due to the vaccination, he received I don't know, any complications, and then he passed away. So how do you see this situation, and how would it affect? And do you think that the employee's family could have also engaged in a legal action against the company for like making it mandatory when the law or the, what they call it, the regulations in our country has never dictated such?
Okay, I think this is the issue I was trying to deal with earlier. You're right. This is a real risk, isn't it? As I mentioned, in every drug or everything that we do, there is that risk of it going wrong. It's never 100% working for everybody. In fact, last night, I met one of my doctor friends, even some of the healthcare workers also. He was saying some have rashes, and then those with asthma, they are required to stay on after the jab for half an hour while they observe you to see if there's any adverse reaction, because there's a chance that you might have a reaction which might require to them even giving you some oxygen at that point in time within this half an hour period. I don't know, based on some data, for whatever reason, they said asthma half an hour. So yes, there is this risk, and which is why if you do make it mandatory and the employee says, I did it because my employer has told me I must do it, and then now, as a result, I can't get out of bed, or I've passed away, okay, the family comes back and says this employee sole breadwinner has passed away because of following employers' instructions, yes, you do face this risk, which is why I mentioned just now, this mandatory must be, what do you call it, like a last resort, right? And in terms of your messaging, it has to be made clear that they should get advice from their own medical advisor before undertaking it and assess the risk on their own. There's no way for you to know each and every employee's health condition, right? You don't know whether 2 weeks ago you had some chest pain or something like that. You don't know. The employee has to make that independent assessment. And what's this? I know this is like not the friendly way of persuading people, but if you went there, if you really wanted to be safe, you can even put in there to say, get them to sign off on something to say, I understand the risk, I will do my own assessment and so on, and I will not hold the employer liable. Now, all very nice legally for me to say this. Practically, that's also something to manage, right? Because if you put something like this, maybe some employee was not concerned about getting vaccinated, will suddenly become very concerned, saying, oh, why?
Yes. I was about to say that.
Why are they asking me and telling me telling me this? All right. So maybe when you get the employee to sign off, you can have a bit of longer document, and then somewhere in the middle there put this in. And,
I think they will disagree.
Yeah. But it's a real risk if you make it mandatory. Of course, it's not a real risk, not so much of a risk if it's the employee does it out of their own volition, which is why that OCBC messaging, which is what Siew mentioned just now, it is it's basically, I think what you were saying was like, look, it's your decision. We encourage you. We are here to. Sorry, it's your decision. We are here to support you all the way, and this is our support, right? And I guess now the reality is when we talk about herd immunity, the reality is it's also a herd mentality as well. If a lot of people get vaccinated, your friends get vaccinated, your relatives get vaccinated, and then maybe even if your friends or relatives don't want to see you because you didn't get vaccinated, they don't want to go out with you. Society also can play its role, just with this herd mentality also can get more and more people going to approve it. I mean, to want to get vaccinated or seriously at least consider, unless they have a underlying medical condition. Okay, if there are no further questions, I want to thank you very much for attending this. Yeah, sorry.
Can I just one last question?
Sure.
Okay. I think everybody is pretty much aware that within our country itself, we have a group of people who are pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine. So let's say if we have such situation in the company where the company has already so-called encouraged its employees to get vaccinated, and then the company also receives a report from any of its representatives saying that, hey, this employee or that particular employee or this group of employees are instigating others not to be vaccinated and so on. So how do you view this? Can the company, because since the law itself is not mandating this, so when the employee is instigating, preventing the company to get all of its workforce to be vaccinated, so can we take such action to the extent of disciplining and including dismissing him?
No, I think it comes back, right? Because it's also a viewpoint. Because if you are not making this mandatory yourself and you are just employing persuasion, based on the principle of freedom of speech, other people can also exercise their right to talk and to persuade others not to do certain things. And as you correctly mentioned, there's a risk, right, to the employer if you make it, if you do make it mandatory. So yes, you will be facing these people who will come there and say, "Oh, look, vaccination, worst thing in the world." This is their point of view, and if you disagree with this, and I would think most sensible employers will disagree with it, then you need to take your own measures to counter some of this. You could probably get a doctor to come there and speak to your staff, for example, to educate them on the benefits of vaccination, the things that they should be looking out for when they did when they do their vaccination, for example, whether you have any underlying issues and so on. Maybe your CEO can be the first one in the company to be vaccinated, just like our PM was the first one to be vaccinated, and show that, look, even I am getting vaccinated. I mean, all these things, what you're doing is you're trying to instill confidence in your working population, so that they will want to get vaccinated, and they will benefit from it. So I think no, I would say you cannot take disciplinary action unless you, like I said, in those extreme situations, you go and make it mandatory. Extreme, it has to be really mandatory. Then this person is then undermining the company in that situation. But in most cases, the answer is no. You cannot. You shouldn't be taking disciplinary action against somebody just for saying, "I don't believe vaccination is a good idea." Shuli, you got anything to add?
No, I mean, I agree. I think, again, we just have to employ power of persuasion to counter the message that's being sent out by these employees. So it goes back to communication. And I think communication is truly key. And I think the employer also has to really employ all it can lah, to counter that message and to send out the message that it wants to send out in terms of vaccination.
Okay, so back to the explanation that Suli gave earlier when you say that we can craft a vaccination policy under Section 16 of OSHA to notify the importance of getting vaccinated. So this also, although the company has this in place, it means it still cannot mandate or make it compulsory for all of its employees, like just in a sense of getting employee aware about the existence of this vaccination and and encouraging them to get vaccinated. Correct?
Yes, that's correct. And it's also to govern all those other things as well, whether you're providing benefits or not, what are the benefits you are providing. Your policy also can be used to explain what the process is for people to seek exceptions. If, let's say, they cannot medically, they are unable to be vaccinated. So it should actually spell out all those processes as well.
So the one that we can include in our employment terms, where the employee has to be vaccinated before they can be on board, then should not pose an issue or any risk for us, correct?
No, for new recruits, no problem. You can make it a term
Okay,
of your
okay.
employment.
All
Yeah.
right, all right.
No, in fact, I just want to add, I think, like, even the policy, if you want, what I would also ask you to consider is to put in the rationale behind why this policy is in place. And ideally, what you should be doing is quote some authoritative source, whether it's the WHO or the government or someone like that, in the thing, and say that this policy is to support these efforts. As I mentioned right at the beginning, if not for vaccines, a lot of people would have just died of smallpox and polio and all sorts of other things, right? But even those smallpox and polio vaccines also has its risk. It's not 100%. But at the end, all you can do is encourage it. Maybe if the people can see the rationale as well in your policy, they better understand why you're doing this. And what you want to get is buy-in.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Any more questions? Will there be any more questions from the participant?
Yeah, actually, I've got a question here. Okay. Well, everything that's being said and done, we assume that people are rational creatures, but we know they are actually not. So they have their own conspiracy theories and all these things. So getting buy-ins sometimes may not necessarily work and may not be will not be something easy for us to do, especially when it comes to the irrational people. Then looking at my current situation, my company is a manufacturing site. So what happens if, let's say, our customers made an audit and told us that we need to have all our employees that's related to their products to be vaccinated? Then can we make it mandatory for the staff to be vaccinated? And then if not, what are the alternatives that we may have, especially my manufacturing site is unionized?
Okay, the thing is, when a customer makes such a request, the issue is also whether that customer's request is reasonable. If it's a case, for example, that they are worried that, oh, while you're manufacturing the product, then accidentally some droplet or something like that will get on the product and then it'll survive while you are exporting this to US or something, I think this is probably unreasonable, because I understand that this virus can only live on the surfaces for about 48 hours. Second thing is, again, when it comes to the reasonableness, if you have a situation where you're getting all your employees to wear PPE, which address these customers' concerns, then I think this is not, again, the customer's request is not going to be something that you must just, if you went to court and say, oh, the customer request, I don't think the court is going to agree with you that this is a necessary thing to do. So what I'm saying here is, look, we need to, of course, understand the customer's concern. We may also, in this kind of situation, have to deal with the customer and try and persuade them otherwise, right? Because after all, the customer is the lifeblood, isn't it, of every business. No customer, no money. So you need to manage that. But at the same time, no employee also got no money, right? Because you cannot perform and produce for the customer. So just because there's a customer request, unless, of course, there is an extenuating circumstance, say maybe the customer's employees need to be on the shop floor and supervise the work that is being done to do some audits on a daily basis or regular basis, like they're standing there like a site representative and they are concerned about their employee also getting COVID, then maybe it is something to consider in terms of the customer's request. And as I said, mandatory, this must be done, I would say, as a last resort. And I agree with you. Not everybody is going to be logical and act in a rational way and accept persuasion. But you need to at least show you tried, and you tried very, very hard. And after you have tried very, very hard, and if still the employee does not agree, and this is posing a health and safety issue to your customer, which is a legitimate health and safety issue, then I think at that point, when you come to that last resort, then you might need to start thinking, do I make it mandatory? Because as you can see from the earlier question also, when you make it mandatory, then you have another issue, isn't it? The other issue is also, what if something happens to the employee in the process? What if it later turns out that I mean, look, I'm not saying this, but later turns out that there are some side effects that we find out 2 years down the line from taking this particular vaccine, and it's because you made it mandatory. They went ahead and took the vaccine, and they suffered this after effects. And now they come back, and then you might face a legal suit. So again, look at how to persuade, right? You may try to understand what is the underlying concern that they are facing, that's causing this resistance. Is it medical? If it's medical, get a medical practitioner. If it's religious, then maybe you find a religious teacher or something, or somebody who is going to be able to come and talk from that angle. If it is some other reason, as I mentioned, there was this Australian case. The employee said, "My human rights, I don't care. I'm just not going to do it." Then I agree. Then you are facing a problem. But as I said, this is you also need to try and create this herd mentality, isn't it? Because say now I didn't get vaccinated, and Suli went and got vaccinated. I'm sure after this, and then she finds out I'm not vaccinated. After this, maybe Suli won't go for lunch or anything like that with me. Maybe the meeting or she'll be standing far away from the door and looking at me, wearing full protection in case I pass her. That, and of course, when I see something like this, it would be natural human reaction then to, this is too hard. Maybe I need to change. Maybe I need to rethink what I did. So I know it's a lot of work, but I think a lot of you in HR, this is what is this? I'm sure you've had to persuade them to do all kinds of other things, employees to do all kinds of other things. This is just another interesting challenge or experience in the life of HR manager, I think.
That's putting it very nicely.
All the best.
But yeah, I know it's not easy go to doing it mandatory. Just that there are some concerns in this, in the sense that, because we know for a fact, we do not know too much about the virus. We do not know what is the actual time span it can survive. You say it's 48 hours. Some reports are saying it can survive up to 7 days. We have fishes with the virus inside that came all the way from a different continent, kind of thing. So it is a very unknown factor at this point in time, and it becomes a concern for us in the sense that our products goes into various things. It goes into toys, it goes into food stuff and all these things. It goes into your shampoo, and people are handling it. And for a fact, guys, the Malaysians are not exactly very compliant in terms of SOPs. We tell them to wear masks, and these guys are asking them to die like that. So so ask them to wash their hands, and it's like, well, they're washing in front of you, and then after that, whatever they do, you wouldn't know. So it becomes a concern in the sense that, if customers do ask that, we will be in a bit of a conundrum on how we can handle it, and we cannot fire the guys if they don't want to do it either.
Okay, I thought it was already established. I don't know, at least from some literature, that they only last for like 48 hours on surface. Now they changed, is it?
Yeah, I've read it came out. That some surface are clear plastics. It can survive longer and all these things. So
I see.
They don't really know the answers to things, and I don't know the answers to things. So it's something new, and the whole world have been failing it for the past 1 year. So I do not know what's the answer for all these things. Just that in terms of employment side, we have to have something that we can go and know what actions we can take and what things we can consider and all these things.
Yeah, sure. No, look, it's a reality that not just you face, we also face, right? I mean, I tell you, look, I mean, we also in a law firm here, we also have to now think about how to persuade our staff to do this. We may not be dealing with manufacturers in dealing with similar issues to manufacturing, but certainly, I mean, look, what if our clients come and say, look, I want your lawyers to be vaccinated because we are going to come for meetings there, and I'm too afraid. So we are all facing similar dilemmas on how to get this done. Of course, it hasn't come to a stage where we need to confront it so much because there's no supply, isn't it? There's not enough supply also. One vaccine also cannot. So, but it's probably at some point, I suspect it's probably going to be like 6 months or so down the track where it's going to become more of a critical issue. Okay.
Any more questions? No more question? Okay, we're going to end this webinar on behalf of IR Law. Thank you for joining us today. However, before leaving, we appreciate if you can let us know your feedback by answering the poll questions in front of you right now. Our next webinar will be on 10th and 20th of May. Email or WhatsApp me anytime to get the details. Until then, thank you and goodbye. Thank you, Mr. Kumar. Thank you, Ms. Siew. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care,
Goodbye.
everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.